Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank Doug and everyone associated with the National Archives Museum. This is one of our favorite, actually it's one of my favorite places. This is my second time here. It's Tom's first. We actually fought over who would get to do this, and that's why you're getting us both today. We had to flip a coin. You might have noticed too that when Doug introduced me, I sounded like Susan Lucci, you know, all these things I've been nominated for, I never won one. So anyway, this book, it's a bit different. Doug mentioned our earlier books. This book, we feel, and we hope you feel when you read it, it's basically an untold story until now about how one man created an empire, if you will, on the high plains. At one point, Red Cloud's territory included about 1/5 of what is today the contiguous United States. And no one before, we don't think, really knew what was going on in that great swath of territory, bounded by the Missouri rivers, the Mississippi River, and the Rockies. And cartographers, early cartographers, despite Lewis and Clark's exploration, they just labeled it the Great American Desert. And Red Cloud's story, his narrative, his timeline, fits with so much that we didn't know what was going. There were no newspaper men. There was a few mountain men, a few French-Canadian hunters and trappers, but in that great swath of territory, no one knew what was going on in the 1820s, the 1830s, the 1840s, even well into the 1850s. And no one knew how Red Cloud had consolidated this empire. Now, of course, when he fought his war and won his war against the United States, the only American Indian to ever win a war, not a battle, a war against the United States, people certainly knew who he was. But this whole narrative, it was just, I hope we found it a hoot and a holler to research and report. I hope you find it the same to write. It was just so exciting. Tom and I both spent a lot of time out west. The historical societies and the university libraries from Nebraska to Wyoming, up east to the Dakotas, north to Montana. And we were a little trepidatious when we first started this book. Our previous 3 collaborations, there had been people to interview. There had been sailors who sailed through Halsey's Typhoon in World War II. There were Marines still alive who kept the road open coming out of the Chosin. 189 Marines held off 10,000 Chinese to allow the 1st Marine Division to get out of the Chosin. And there were certainly Marine security guards alive to interview who had been mistakenly left on the roof of the Saigon Embassy in 1975. Obviously, there was no one left from the 19th century. But what we did find is that our forebears were such literate people. We went into this expecting maybe we'd get some after-action reports from the Army. When the soldiers started moving west, maybe an officer's wife might have kept a journal. As it turns out, every Teamster's wife kept a diary. And we found all these, and letters. And Tom, excuse me, Tom, he'll explain to you, at some of these university libraries and historical centers, they would bring out a journal in a plexiglass case, and you had to turn the pages with tongs because your oil from your fingers would destroy the vellum, I guess it was written on. And there were letters from 12-year-old girls who had passed the Oregon train. You know, Paul was killed last year by the Indians. First train in this year said they dug up his grave. Maybe it was wolves, but we think it might have been Indians again, that kind of stuff. So we actually felt like we were interviewing people for this book. As far-fetched as that might sound, we got into it so much that we felt like we were living the lives with these people. That said, I'm going to have to give you a little what we call the dreaded backstory, because you really can't understand Red Cloud without understanding the Sioux Nation. So I think I'll go to page, who am I kidding? I bore myself when I read. How about if we just tell you a couple of stories? The Sioux Nation, or what was to become the Sioux Nation, obviously, they crossed the Bering Land Bridge some 13 to 15,000 years ago. We're not really quite sure where they started out from. Paleolinguists have picked up traces of the Sioux language as far south as the Mississippi Delta and as far east as North Carolina. What we do know that pre-Columbian Sioux what was to become the pre-Columbian Sioux Nation. It was 7 tribes, the tribes of the 7 council fires. They followed the Mississippi Valley north, and they settled in Minnesota. Now, in Minnesota, they were the baddest Indians in the Great Lake region. And for centuries, they just made unending war on their predominantly Algonquin neighbors, the Cree, the Chippewa. And they were vicious. War was their ethos. Unlike other tribes, they had no non-violent culture. They did not make pots. They did not grow food. They did not even paint anything on their teepees or their shields. War was their reason for being. And the first Europeans, mostly French, who looked at the Sioux, I mean, they were immediately reminded of the Norse berserkers or the Huns or the Mongols. The Sioux lived to make war. That was their ethos. And they were good at it. And they were real good at it. And for centuries, for hundreds of years, they just dominated the region. But then what happened was when the English trading ships started to come into Hudson Bay, and the Cree and the Chippewa, who lived closer to the bay, began trading pelts for guns, and the tables turned. The Sioux, once the Sioux had been the hunter, now they were the hunted. Once they had extolled violence for violence' sake. See, what the Europeans didn't understand, watching in particular the Sioux, but the American Indian culture in general, was it wasn't violence for violence' sake. Yes, they fought wars to gain territory and to bring home booty, but also the old cliche, the happy hunting ground. The Sioux, and most of the Plains tribes for that matter, really believed that there was an afterlife that was a happy hunting ground. And it was filled with clear running streams and game as far as you can see, buffalo and elk and deer and antelope, and beautiful maidens just waiting to be taken. But what happened was they believed that you went to this afterlife in the same way you left the earth. So what the Europeans didn't understand about the scalpings and about the mutilations, and if your enemy went to the happy hunting ground with no eyes to see how beautiful it was, if he went with no arms to draw back a bowstring, if he went with no penis to take advantage of these comely maidens, well, then he had suffered 2 indignities at your hands, one here on earth and one there. And that's what a lot of this was all about. But when the Europeans came down, of course, they didn't understand this at all. They seem to have forgotten about the Inquisition and the Roman Colosseum. And they were civilized, and the Sioux weren't in their eyes. And they started trading guns with the other Indians, and the other Indians began hunting the Sioux, who were still using prehistoric tools, flintlock knives, flintlock arrowheads. They drove the Sioux into the swamps of Minnesota, and finally their territory just became so compromised that they had a choice, an existential choice. They either would die or they had to step out onto the prairie. They ended up stepping out onto the prairie. Even on the prairie, they were still, even though they kept up their warlike ethos, but they were still the tribes we don't think of, the Mandans, the Arikaras, the Rees, the Omahas, the Otos. They were kicking the Sioux's butt because these tribes were mounted and the Sioux were not yet mounted. And one regal Cheyenne, described the Sioux as scraggly, lice-ridden band begging for handouts. That's how bad it was. But that all changed again. The worm turned yet again when the English started coming down, first the Minnesota River and then the Missouri River, and establishing trade fairs. Now they were on the edge of Sioux, this northern Sioux territory, and the Sioux were the first tribes to get weapons, to get guns, to get shot, to get ammunition, to get iron pots that they would break into arrowheads. Sooner or later, the Sioux took their revenge on the smaller tribes that had been almost picking them apart, the Mandans, the Otos, the Rees. And then something happened that changed the course of Western history. The Spanish, I love this part of the book and I love this story, but I won't go too off course here. But I will say, the horse was not endemic to the Western Hemisphere. There had been, in prehistoric times, there had been kind of a proto-horse. It was about the size of a big dog, a collie maybe. Some of them had toes instead of hoofs, but they died out with the mastodon. And when the Spanish brought the tough little Mustang into South America and Mexico, it was a match made in heaven.